One of my absolute favorite games of the last few years is Control. This game is really, really sweet. Not only are the visuals just amazing to look at, this is a really beautifully crafted game, but I was also really drawn into the combat of Control. When this game first came out back in 2019, I played it on the PS4, which is interesting because I bought this game blindly. I only saw like a 5-minute snippet of this video, and then I saw Jesse, the main character, floating around, throwing objects at these guys like telepathically, or rather using telekinesis, and it just looked so cool. And then I saw her like pulling out this pistol and firing like an entire clip on a dude, and then she would pull a chunk out of the wall and launch it at a guy. I just thought it looked so cool, and I bought this game pretty blindly. And man, am I glad I did, because Control quickly became like my favorite game of that year. You could argue about Resident Evil 2, because I'm a huge Resident Evil fan as well, but I don't know, Control just had something about it that I just thought was so unique. Maybe it's the mystique around the oldest house in the story. But the first thing I noticed about this game was the board. The board is like this big giant upside down pyramid that telepathically communicates with you as you are appointed the director of the Federal Bureau of Control, a secret underground government agency dealing with supernatural objects that contain powers, not too dissimilar from like the SCP mythologies on the internet. I don't even know if mythologies is the right word to use, but the story does take a lot of similarities from that. But it also just becomes this weird, like, what's really going on here kind of story that I was really drawn into. Over the course of the game, Jessie unlocks new abilities, such as telekinesis, where she can throw objects without having to contact them. She can also throw chunks off of a wall, or rather rip a chunk out of a wall or off the ground and throw it at enemies. And then eventually she gains the ability to dash, and she can use that defensively. Also, if you're falling, you do have fall damage in this game, you can dash just before you hit the ground and it negates all fall damage. She also unlocks some melee abilities too, and then you have like the multi-launch and the DLCs as well. But I always thought that the combat in this game was just so cool. But my only complaint about Control is just, you can basically fight everybody the same way, like you just levitate up in the air and you use the service weapon and then you use your telekinesis. You are limited to how many of your powers you can use. Like you have a meter that prevents you from using your powers and just like spamming the telekinesis or whatever. But there's not a lot of variety in the enemies. You can basically just levitate and then use your telekinesis to throw a bunch of objects and then shoot on the enemies, and that'll reliably get you everywhere. There are a couple of enemies that can fly, and then you have to sort of dodge out of the way in midair, but outside of that, it doesn't really force you to change up your style that much. But outside of combat, which I do think is very fun, the visuals of this game are also great too. And sometimes you have live action video that's mixed in with the gameplay. These really just help to expand the lore of Control because there's a lot to it. The game isn't necessarily straightforward about answering a lot of things too, like it'll answer one question but then open up 5 more. But these videos are incredibly interesting, and I'm just so drawn into this very mysterious world. Maybe we'll never truly figure out what's going on, but the main story involves Jessie trying to look for her lost brother Dylan, and she winds up in this place called the Oldest House, which is the headquarters of the secret government agency, the Federal Bureau of Control. And she becomes appointed director after the death of the previous director. And later it's explained that she didn't find the oldest house, it found her. And apparently it was her destiny, her fate, to become the new director. But eventually it unravels into an even bigger, more complicated, sophisticated problem. There's also a janitor who's, I believe, Swedish, and he initially just tries to kind of avoid the questions that Jesse asks him, but you always have this feeling of he knows a lot more than he lets on to know. And Jesse also suspects this in the game as well. Earlier, I mentioned an upside-down pyramid called the board. This is more or less what the board looks like. It's an upside-down pyramid and it speaks to you telepathically, and I think that that is so cool. I have a thing for pyramids. I cannot explain it. I just think pyramids are cool as hell. It's fascinating to me. Maybe Daft Punk did this. I can't really tell. But that's basically what the board looks like. I hope you like the color red, because this game's final mission has a lot of it. These aren't necessarily story spoilers, but this is the final level of the game. Now, in the final level, the whole screen is red. I'm not talking about like Wong Kar-wai In the Mood for Love levels red. It's just the final mission, not the whole game. But your corneas are going to be stained after this. Like, you look at a wall and it's green. But it's cool because Jessie is so powerful. She has basically, I don't know if it's maxed out abilities, but Jessie defeats these enemies very easily. And it feels great because you have so much power under your hand. But I mean, look at this. I mean, sometimes enemies do kind of blend into the walls because the enemies, called the Hiss in this game, also do tend to blend in because they're red too, so you gotta watch out for that. But Jessie's so powerful that it really doesn't even matter that much. But outside of the really beautifully written story and the mystique behind it, at least I think it's beautifully written. Some people are like, this game doesn't explain anything. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool because it doesn't have to. And outside of the really exhilarating combat, which is kind of the same across the entire game, but it's so cool that you don't really care. This game's visuals, the setting, it's just fascinating to me. And I'm so infatuated by it. Like, of course, there's like these old ass corporate like office buildings, but occasionally Jessie will find a document on the floor that sort of describes some minor thing in a corner of a room. So there's a lot of lore. It fleshes it out over the course of the game, but as I said, it never really gives you a direct answer as to what's going on, what the board is, what the oldest house is, where it came from. It just sort of exists, and you have to try to figure out the inner workings of it to try to prevent the Hiss invasion. This game does have assist options like invincibility and one-hit kills, which I do think is great, because Control's not a hard game necessarily, but the second Tamasi fight, not this one, this was the first. The second Tamasi fight was really difficult. I did it legitimately, and I felt really bad afterwards. But, that's how it is. Overall, Control is a fantastic game. My only gripe about this game is that the enemies don't have a lot of variety, and you can perform the same exact combat strategy basically the entire game with little to no repercussion. If it weren't for that one tiny thing, this would be a 10 out of 10. But as it is now, Control is an 8 out of 10.